Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with what I'm calling my first impressions video of the F-15E, although it's really not. But the title, What I Thought of the F-15 After I Thought About It for a While, didn't seem like it would fit very well on a thumbnail, so I decided to leave it with the first impressions. Basically, it's taken me a while to make this video because I really did need to wrap my head around the topic of the Mudhen, to try and figure out exactly what makes it different than other aircraft and how it's different in DCS than some of the other aircraft you might want to fly. And, you know, honestly, besides which, a lot of other YouTubers have done a much better job of describing how to fly and fight and use the systems in the F-15E than I would ever do, because they have spent a lot more time in the airframe than I have, honestly. And I did do my little video on dropping iron bombs with the Mudhen, because of course that's what I do. But after that, I wanted to take a little bit of time to get to know it and understand how it fits in with other jets, particularly the jets in DCS, before I said anything more. Now, if you know my channel, you may also know that in addition to dropping bombs the old-fashioned way, I'm also very interested in, let's say, the history of military aviation. Or specifically, I would say that I'm kind of interested in why aircraft were designed the way they were and how those designs worked out in the real world. And also how they end up looking and flying in DCS. And in order to do that, I had to do a bit of research on the F-15E, both in the game, but also in the background history. See, the thing about the F-15E is that a lot of the things that made it a very important development have actually been replicated in later aircraft or later versions of aircraft like the F-16 and the F-18. So if you just compare the aircraft that are available in the sim, which are really from a kind of variety of eras because of the subsystems that are implemented in them, some of the rationale of why the F-15E is the way it is, or why it is at all, might not actually be that obvious. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So let's back the truck up and understand where the F-15E Strike Eagle came from. Well, that's obvious, you might say. It came from the F-15C, right? Well, that's true. But the bigger question is, how did an aircraft like the F-15 that was designed to be the best air supremacy fighter ever designed, with a design philosophy that was summed up as not 1 pound for air to ground, end up being the premier strike fighter of a generation, effectively? To understand that, you have to go back to 1978. At the time, the United States Air Force was operating the F-15 for air superiority, the F-16 as a multi-role tactical fighter, the F-4 as a multi-role aircraft for both air superiority and long-range medium strike, the A-7 for ground attack, light strike, and close air support, although the A-10 was also on its way to take over those roles. They also had the F-111 that was a dedicated heavy and deep strike fighter bomber, including having responsibility for an awful lot of the Tactical Air Command's nuclear missions. Also had a host of specialized aircraft for electronic warfare and the suppression of air defense missions. Now, the F-15 and 16 were relatively new, so really the air superiority and kind of the multi-role aspects of things were reasonably well in hand. But the Air Force really wanted to replace the various strike aircraft that it had with a single airframe. It also wanted some significant electronic warfare capability in that airframe, as well as the ability to hold its own in air-to-air, because they didn't want it to require a dedicated escort, which any of the strike fighters that they were currently operating actually did. The main competitors for this new strike aircraft were a 2-seat version of the F-15 and a supersized version of the F-16. The F-15 version 1, and it became the F-15E, so that's where the strike fighter came from. Strike Eagle, you have to see it not really in comparison to the F-18 and the F-16, you have to see it as a successor to the F-111 and the F-4. It was designed to carry large loads, fly low, fly fast, and deliver those payloads on fixed, pretty much pre-planned targets. It was designed to do this in all weather, meaning in conditions of low or effectively no visibility. Thus, while most people fixate on the airframe, because honestly, it's an F-15, in fact, the most important feature of the Strike Eagle was actually its avionics, particularly its radar and electronic warfare suite. In fact, its most important system really was its radar. which was able to provide the same functionality for automated terrain following that the F-111 had enjoyed. It was able to provide also air-to-air functionality comparable to the F-15, which would support not only AIM-7 Sparrow, but also the anticipated arrival of the much longer-range AIM-120 AMRAAM. But most importantly, perhaps, it would take advantage of the latest advances in ground radar, including ground-moving target indication and synthetic aperture radar. Now, discussion of these two technologies really beyond the scope of this video, but they do represent very impressive advances in the late 1970s in the ability to use radar to image things. And the important thing, I think, for planners at the time was they represented technologies and capabilities that were simply not present in the Warsaw Pact, because one of the biggest advantages that the West enjoyed over the Warsaw Pact at that time was the state of its electronics industry. And so really, the F-15E was a way of getting those advanced radar technologies into a platform. Effectively, to understand how impressive this was, GMTI meant that you could actually spot moving vehicles on the ground 20 nautical miles away so that they could be targeted. As well, synthetic aperture radar meant that you could resolve things down to 2 or 3 meters at a range of out to 20 nautical miles. This was simply standoff functionality that there was nothing in the Warsaw Pact that was ever going to match it. And so it really was an important facet in making the strike aircraft more survivable, because it would just mean that it would be able to operate a lot farther from the air defenses that were meant to counter it, but be able to gain situational awareness about those defenses that was much more precise than had ever been possible before. It would also be able to carry the latest in targeting pods, which would allow it to deliver bombs with unprecedented precision using laser guidance. Targeting pods were not new, but until certainly in the late 1970s and 80s, they were still restricted to use by heavy strike aircraft like the F-111 and occasionally the F-4. Now, also less talked about, probably because there's a lot less information out there about it because it's classified, is that the advances in electronic warfare meant that by the late 1970s, a fighter-sized aircraft could actually carry a system that would sensitively identify and take countermeasures against a very wide range of emitters. And this was a functionality that really wasn't present in 1980. If you look back at the radar warning receiver technology that was available at the time, Western aircraft were still carrying something that looks much more like what we see in the Soviet aircraft of the day, essentially a clock dial with a light that would light up telling you where the emitter was, with no real indication of what it was or how far away it was. So putting that new RWR in the F-15 that allowed you to have a lot more information about what threat you were facing was actually something that was new to the F-15 at the time. Now, this is a functionality that had been available in dedicated electronic warfare aircraft and bombers previously, but it was because the equipment that generated that kind of information tended to be very heavy, and it also tended to require an expert to operate it. So that was one of the advances that the F-15 was also supposed to take advantage of, was that this EW equipment was now becoming lighter and simpler to operate, and so it could actually be flown on a fighter. So really, in a very real sense, the Strike Eagle was about finding a platform that could be built around this sensor suite. So, which is why, frankly, the U.S. Air Force was fine to use a 10-year-old airframe, which the F-15 was at the time. But the one thing that the United States Air Force also wanted was they wanted a second pilot. They were convinced that an avionics suite that was that sophisticated was not going to be effectively managed by a single crew member, and so they wanted basically a two-seat aircraft, and so that's how we ended up with the F-15E. Now, it's interesting to compare the Strike Eagle to the Navy's new aircraft at the time, which was the F-18. Now, the F-18 was essentially the United States Navy's response to the same desire to replace a variety of platforms with a single one, built essentially around the same avionics suite that was available for the F-15. The Navy wanted to replace the A-7, the A-6, the F-4, and even the F-14, which all covered essentially the same suite of roles as the United States Air Force was trying to replace Although the Navy didn't have the equivalent of the F-111 because they really didn't have a deep strike mission, especially not a nuclear-oriented deep strike mission. But they did want to make use of the advances in radar and ground imaging and GMTI and the ability to carry a targeting pod. And in fact, if you fly the F-18, which is the base model F-18 that arrived at basically the same time as the F-15E did, if you fly both of those in DCS in the front seat, you'll find that there's an awful lot of similarity in terms of sensors and weapons employment. So essentially, the Navy built what ended up being an upscale version of the aircraft that had lost the competition to the F-16 to be the United States Air Force tactical fighter, and this became the F-18. Both the F-18 and the F-15E arrived almost simultaneously in the early mid-'80s. But an interesting thing happened on the way to the new millennium. Effectively, the conflict and the combat environment that both the F-15 and F-18 had been designed for disappeared. And avionics continued to evolve and become smaller and lighter and less power-hungry. So whereas the expected war against the Warsaw Pact in Europe that had prioritized low-level penetration in all weather and long-range targeting by radar didn't happen, the conflicts in the Persian Gulf did, and they demonstrated the need for medium-altitude, long loiter missions. With shorter-range EO targeting, the long-range radar stuff was not really needed because the air defense system was not sophisticated enough to require it, but they also required a much greater reliance on precision targeting. In other words, the sensor of primary interest really became the targeting pod rather than the radar. Also, it has to be noted that this targeting pod technology got smaller, less demanding on power, and critically, a lot cheaper. So rather than being reserved for the heavy, dedicated precision strike aircraft like it had been in the 80s and 90s, the weapons it supported gradually became ubiquitous across just about every multi-role fighter. I mean, remember in the 1990s, in the first Gulf War, the targeting pods that the USAF deployed were carried almost exclusively by F-111s. A decade later, they were basically on all strike aircraft. So these effects had an interesting but opposite effects on the United States Air Force and the United States Navy. In the USAF, it drove a movement to upgrade the F-16 platform to give it much more comprehensive precision strike capabilities. On the Navy side, it had the opposite effect. It convinced them that what they really needed was a larger airframe than the F-18 with a greater payload capacity and range. They also wanted some attack aircraft that actually had a second crew member that could handle very complex strike missions, which ultimately led to the Super Hornet E and F models with the two-seater F model designed specifically for long-range strike missions. So essentially we have the situation today that if you were to sit in any of the cockpits of the frontline U.S. fighters, the F-15E, 16, or 18, you'd basically find yourself able to carry pretty much all of the same missions regardless of which airframe you were sitting in. There'd be differences in how they do it and maybe how well adapted they are to the task, but you would essentially be able to do just about all of the same missions in all three fighters. So that kind of begs the question, as far as DCS is concerned, is why the F-15E? Why another airframe that's capable of basically carrying out the same missions that you already have in two airframes in DCS? Which is not to say that I don't think there are good reasons for the F-15. I think it's just you have to be a little bit careful about assuming that it's because it represents brand new capabilities. Maybe to illustrate what I'm talking about, I think the easiest thing to do is to actually fly a mission. Actually, I'm going to fly the same mission twice. I'm going to fly it once in the F-18, then I'm going to fly it again in the F-15E and take a look at what is actually different in the F-15 than in the F-18. So let's take a look at the mission we're going to fly. It's a very simple mission to take out a couple of bridges. We're on the Caucasus map. We're going to start down here offshore from Batumi. Our targets are going to be a couple of bridges here, just north of this lake. Actually, the target isn't both bridges. The target is actually the railway bridge, and actually there's three bridges. So it's, one of the moderate challenges in the mission is actually picking the right bridge, although for both of these aircraft, this isn't exactly going to be a very challenging mission, mostly because we're not flying it with any opposition. But anyways, our plan is going to be to fly this route. In the initial part of the route, we're going to get the radar set up. We're going to turn northeast to give us a good angle on the target, because using either the Doppler beam sharpening mode or the synthetic aperture radar mode, you want to be offset from the target a little bit. Once we have successfully acquired the target with the radar and designated it, we'll pass it over to the targeting pod, and then we'll actually drop a laser-guided bomb on the target using the laser from the targeting pod. Okay, let's hop in the F-18 first and see how this is going to work. As you can see, as promised, we are offshore Batumi. We're just getting ourselves sorted out. You can see we've got the air-to-ground radar on the right-hand screen. Now, as you can see, our target is pretty much off to the left of our radar now. So that's why we're going to have to come around a little bit to the left, extend our range out. We're going to know that we're close when we can start seeing that lake on the low-fidelity radar here. And if you are watching the radar, you'll see it start to appear in a minute here. We're just getting our laser set up in the F-18. This is definitely one of the things that's different from plane to plane, is how you set up the weapons, not so much the weapons themselves, but a little bit of the weapon setup. So now you can see we're coming down the coast. You can start to see that lake appearing off the top left of the radar screen. So we are in position now to go to high resolution mode, or expanded mode, they call it in the F-18, and see if we can't eventually identify those bridges. So I just have to remember the method for moving the patch in the radar mode in the F-18. Keeping track of how each of the various aircraft do things is half the problem here, because they all do the same things, but they all do it a little bit differently. So we can see in this first expanded mode, we can definitely see the lake. We can see the river to the north of the lake, but we can't quite see the bridges yet. We got to go a little bit farther before we're going to be able to pick them up. That's the external view again. So let's go and let's take another crack at an expanded view. Okay, now we definitely can see the river, and we can see some returns that might be bridges. We just need to get the right ones. So we'll zoom in a little bit more. Definitely see where the bridges are now on that radar. So we'll go to the final expansion and try to pick up the bridges close enough that we can actually designate one. Let's see, that doesn't look like it was successful. Not sure what happened there. Let's try that again. Zoom back out. We'll zoom in. And once again, that doesn't look like what I was expecting. Let's try it one more time. Okay, bridges are definitely there. Let's zoom in. Move the patch around just to make sure it knows we want something different than... There we go. That's what we're looking for. And now it starts refining that picture. Oops, looks like they're going to jump, so we don't want to designate just yet. Okay, so while we're doing that, we'll set up the left-hand screen to display the T-pod. Now, once again, for those of you who fly the Hornet all the time, I may very well not be doing this as efficiently as I might. I don't fly the Hornet a lot. I'd certainly defer to anybody's greater expertise, but I just want to show you, how it's possible to do this kind of mission, just so we can compare it to how it looks in the F-15. Okay, so we have selected the target on the radar, and the T-pod is now slave to that. And we're going to have to get a little bit closer before we're able to refine that. We've zoomed in pretty much as far as we can on the T-pod. It's pretty hard to see the bridge at this range, which is, by the way, still more than 20 nautical miles away. So while we're waiting for things to get themselves set up here, I just want to point out that the radar mode in the F-18, I believe, is the Doppler beam sharpening mode, not a synthetic aperture radar mode, although the radar that the 18 carries, even this model, the F-18, was capable of synthetic aperture mode. I don't think that's what's being emulated in DCS. mostly because of the way the image appears. When we see the F-15, you'll see that in synthetic aperture radar mode, it actually doesn't give you an image right away. It has to collect data for 7 seconds before it's able to actually show you a picture, and that would be typical of a synthetic aperture radar, which works by taking multiple snapshots and then combining them and using the fact that the aircraft has moved between those snapshots to actually refine the picture that it gives you. Whereas Doppler beam sharpening mode works by basically using Doppler information to improve the image continuously. So I think that what the 18 is showing us is a Doppler beam sharpen mode, not a synthetic aperture radar mode. We'll see that difference when we get to the F-15. Okay, now the bridge is well and truly visible, and so we are picking up our acquisition for the laser. We're down to about 10 nautical miles. We're ready to drop the bomb. Going to try and zoom in right on that pier in the middle of the bridge. We're actually having the autopilot steer the aircraft. Try a variety of tracking modes. So the bridge is not an easy target to get the system to lock on automatically, so I tend to like to refine my aim all the way to the bomb impact. And of course you can do that. You can keep moving the laser spot after you've dropped the bomb. Okay, last 5 miles. Time to press the release the pickle, and the bomb is gone. And so now we just need to keep refining that aim, keep it in the middle of the bridge deck as we fly over the target. And 2 seconds to impact as we go over top. And shack, which is a surprise to no one. Okay, so that's how you do it in the F-18. Let's recycle and take a look at what that looks like in the F-15. Okay, here we are in the Mudhen. As you can see, it does take even a couple of seconds to know which aircraft you're in. There are differences, but there are also an awful lot of similarities. And as we did in the F-18, first thing we have to do is get our radar scanning, and then we're going to go off here and we are going to get our T-pod and our stores set up. And same thing, if we look at the radar, we can see that we haven't quite got our target area on screen yet. So we're going to bend around a little bit to the left here and wait till we get within range. We're sticking to the 40 nautical mile range because we know that we can't get any of our high resolution modes at longer range than that. So we probably could see the target if we expanded the range, but we wouldn't be able to see the target there anyways. Okay, so we're just about to the point where the target's on screen, so we'll go to the first high resolution mapping mode. And as I said, you can immediately see the difference here in that the radar pauses for 7 seconds before it gives us a picture, which to me implies that it's using synthetic aperture radar mode. And we know where the target is because we've got a waypoint laid on it, so we can go right to the zoomed in mode here. And there, again, after 7 seconds, now you can really see the difference in quality of this image. And we're just going to designate that as a target. T-pod's going to slave to it. And hey presto, we're back where we were in the F-18. We just need to make sure that we're ready to drop the bomb on this target. Do need to remember to turn the master arm on. Okay, as in the F-18, actually we did a bit better than the F-18. We're more than 30 miles from this target. 5 minutes from actually dropping the bomb, but we have already acquired the target and slewed the T-pod to it. Now, you can see that the F-18 certainly gives you a much better picture than the F-18. And I think this is the difference between what the F-15E gives you and the F-18. You can accomplish this mission with the tools that are available to you in the F-18, no problem. But the F-15E does, this really shows off the new capabilities of the F-15E radar. But, you know, how are you going to make use of those in the game? And I think that's really the question. And to me, in some ways, I think that the real key to the value of the F-15E, the thing that we can do that didn't used to be able to do, it's not finding targets on the radar. You could do that with the F-18. But I think actually, with the addition of the ability to do multi-crew, where we could actually have a guy in the back who was operating the radar and doing a much more complex task than this, something that involved real situational awareness in terms of trying to find targets on the ground, including SAM radar sites at 30 nautical miles away, which you certainly could do with the imaging capability of this radar. I think that's going to be the real value. When you're in the front seat, and if we were in a missile engagement zone, we were having to worry about SAMs, or we were having to worry about air-to-air threat in the front cockpit, we just wouldn't have the bandwidth to be doing a lot of looking around trying to find targets on the ground. But if we had a guy in the back who that was his only job, I think that that would give us the ability to do much more sophisticated missions. We could find targets, we could find potential threats, we could make a plan, especially if we also had wingmen, like wingmen that were flying F-16s configured for SEAD. Then we could be actually helping them target their harm missiles. So, I think it's actually the presence of the second crew member combined with these very high-resolution radar imaging modes that make the F-15E really interesting in DCS and give us the ability to do stuff that we didn't used to do before. So that's what I'm excited about trying. The radar is very interesting, and I've enjoyed using it, and I've enjoyed learning to fly the F-15. Don't get me wrong, I don't begrudge buying it at all, at least partly because it's an F-15E, and who doesn't want to fly an F-15? But I think in terms of, really a different experience in DCS, something that we haven't been able to do in any of the other aircraft, I think I'm really looking forward to being able to fly this in multi-crew and do some really sophisticated things with the imaging capabilities that it gives us. So let me just fast forward here through the last 40 seconds or so. We're still 10 miles from the target after all of that blathering on. Okay, here we are a little closer. 5 miles out. 3 seconds from drop. There's the pickle. There's the bombs away. Still at this altitude, we got over 20 seconds until we actually even until we're going to see impact. Same issue as with the F-18, we have to keep the laser basically centered on the bridge deck if we want to make sure we're going to hit it. Using a slightly larger bomb this time on the F-15E. The F-15E does carry 30-40% more payload than in the F-18. That is certainly a difference as well. And again, I think that gives you the ability to do much more sophisticated missions where you carry a variety of armament. And there you go, shack the bridge. And we have once again successfully engaged the target. So, that's a quick, or maybe not so quick, analysis of the F-15, where it came from, what capabilities it has compared to other jets we fly in DCS, and I think, where it's going to be a really interesting addition to the DCS stable, and for me that's going to be particularly the area of multi-crew. So I'm really looking forward to hopping in the back seat of this aircraft and really finding out what the sensor suite can do while somebody up front does the driving. At any rate, that's going to be it for me today. As always, if you enjoy these videos, please like and subscribe, and for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.